A Navy SEAL inherited his grandmother's lake house and chose to disappear from the world. But his loyal German shepherd refused to let him run. The east wind shifted, the lake began to lie, and a blizzard erased every path home. In the whiteout, the lost had only one thing left to follow: the light on the island. He didn't come to save anyone, but destiny pulled him out of the dark. Miracles don't roar. Sometimes they are a light switched on and a man who chooses to stay. Where are you watching from? Like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 followers. Every follow gives us strength to create more powerful stories. Now, let's begin. The letter arrived in a plain white envelope that looked too small to carry anything heavy. Adrian Cross turned it over once in his hands, thumb catching the ridge of the seal, and felt that old, practiced patience he'd learned overseas when you couldn't rush what was already on its way to you. The return address belonged to a law office he didn't recognize. The paper smelled faintly of toner and rain, as if it had traveled through weather before it reached him. He opened it at the kitchen counter of a rental that never warmed up, no matter how high he turned the heat. The words were clean and official. The meaning was not. Margaret Hale had died months ago, and she had left him her property, an old cabin on a small granite island in a northern lake. Adrian read the page twice, not because he didn't understand, but because his mind refused to let the sentence settle. He hadn't spoken to Margaret in years, not out of hatred, not even out of distance in miles, just life. The kind that grinds days into dust until you look up and realize you've been absent from your own story. The second page listed coordinates and a county name he had to search to pronounce. The third page described the transfer, the key, the dock access, and the fixture that came with the cabin and exterior light tower, repaired and maintained as per the decedent's long-standing preference. Preference. He almost laughed. Margaret Hale didn't have preferences. She had rules. Behind him, nails clicked softly on the floorboards. Ranger had gotten up without a sound. The German shepherd moved like he was still working quiet feet, measured weight, attention held forward. 6 years old, built lean and strong under a thick sable coat that shifted between cream, gray, and black depending on the light. His muzzle was darker, his eyes amber and steady, and his ears tilted as if the air itself had spoken. He wore a black harness with a deep red trim that looked almost warm against his fur, functional, not decorative, with a handle on top that fit Adrian's grip like it had been designed for his hand alone. Ranger sat beside Adrian and looked up once, then back at the letter. Not curiosity. Assessment. Adrian's jaw tightened. Clean-shaven, always. The razor was one of the few habits he'd kept because it made him feel like he was still choosing something. His square jaw and sharp cheekbones made his expression look harsher than it felt. His skin was fair but weathered, the kind of pale that had been scoured by northern wind until it carried a permanent tan of cold. His hair dark brown, military short but slightly longer than regulation sat neat, even when he didn't try. Discipline had a way of staying behind like a scent. His eyes, at gray-blue and unblinking, stayed on the page, a cabin on an island, not a fresh start, not a second chance. Not the kind of place people moved to when they were feeling hopeful. It was the kind of place someone went when they were tired of being seen. He folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope. For a moment he stood very still, listening to the hush of the apartment. The fridge hummed. A car passed outside. Somewhere, Someone laughed, high and brief-like, a door opening and shutting. Adrian looked down at Ranger. "We're going north," he said. Ranger's tail moved once, not excitement, confirmation. 2 weeks later, the world changed color. The farther north they drove, the more the air seemed rinsed cleaner, sharper, full of pine and water. The sky widened. The roads narrowed. Small towns appeared like afterthoughts, wrapped in bright summer light that made everything look honest, even the things that weren't. Adrian drove with both hands on the wheel, shoulders relaxed but ready, as if the road might try something. His old tactical shirt, olive gray, washed so many times it had softened into the shape of him, clung lightly at the chest and loosened at the elbows where the fabric had worn thin. At the cuffs and shoulders, faint fraying marked where years had dragged against stone and strap and weather. Beneath it, his thermal layer was a darker red muted, but still somehow alive. His combat pants, brown earth and moss green, had scuffed knees and pockets that sagged slightly from habit. Work boots, old military issue, creased at the toes and scratched along the sides, pressed the pedals with quiet control. A plain, battered military watch sat on his wrist, its face simple, its purpose clear. Everything about him said, "Built for function, not for comfort." Ranger lay in the back seat, head up, watching the passing trees. Sometimes he lifted his nose to the air at a scent Adrian couldn't catch. Wildflower, fox, campfire smoke from some unseen place. Adrian didn't stop much. He ate when he had to, slept in short stretches. His body still ran on a clock that didn't belong to civilian life. On the third day, the asphalt ended near a lake that looked like it had been poured from glass. It was summer, but there was something winter-born in that water clarity with an edge. Sunlight cut through the surface so cleanly Adrian could see pale stones at the bottom, even from the dock. A pair of kayaks slid across the lake like brushstrokes. Their paddles dipped and rose without hurry, leaving ripples that widened and disappeared as if the lake refused to hold on to any disturbance for long. And there, out where the water deepened, was the island. A small granite rise, dark and solid, crowned with a cabin that seemed too steady to be real. The house sat like it belonged. Logs darkened with age, roof pitched for snow, windows catching sun. A simple light tower rose near the roofline metal, practical, not romantic. The cabin looked less like a retreat and more like a promise someone had built with their hands and refused to abandon. Adrian stood at the end of the dock and felt his chest tighten in a way he didn't name. This was what Margaret had meant when she spoke of it. He remembered her from childhood summers, Margaret Hale, tall and wiry, hair the color of iron filings pulled back into a severe bun. Skin weathered from wind, hands always smelling faintly of pine sap and metal. Her eyes had been the same shade of steady as lake water under cloud. She rarely smiled, but when she did it was quick, like a match struck in the dark. Margaret didn't coddle. She watched. And when she spoke, it was usually a warning disguised as casual advice. "Don't trust the lake just because it's pretty," she'd said once, kneeling beside him on this same dock, and her voice calm, as if she was teaching him to tie a knot. Pretty things are the ones that get you careless. Adrian had rolled his eyes then, a child offended by the idea that danger could hide in beauty. Now, he understood. A man at the marina office handed him a key and a set of printed instructions. Adrian didn't linger for conversation. He gave his name, signed what needed signing, and carried his duffel-worn, quiet, heavy with a life he didn't talk about, toward a small motorboat tied at the dock. Ranger waited. Not panting, not fidgeting. Just there, muscles easy, eyes working. Adrian started the engine and guided the boat into the water. The motor's low growl vibrated through the hull. The dock receded behind them, and the shore-green trees, sunlit stones, began to slide away. The lake opened. The air smelled like cold water and warm sun at the same time. An impossible blend that made Adrian feel briefly like the world could hold two truths without breaking. Halfway to the island, the engine noise faded into something softer in his head, and his thoughts slid into that place he didn't like to visit. He saw a flash of desert light. A pressure wave. The split second where everything made sense, then didn't. He tightened his grip on the tiller until his knuckles whitened. Ranger stood, paws planted wide for balance, and pressed his shoulder lightly against Adrian's thigh. Not needy, not affectionate. Anchoring. Adrian let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Yeah," he muttered. "I'm here." The island grew larger. Details sharpened dock planks, a narrow path up through short pines, the cabin's front steps. Adrian eased the boat in. The hull kissed the dock with a soft thud. He killed the engine and stepped onto the wood. The planks were sun-warmed and slightly damp at the edges. The lake lapped beneath, quiet as a held secret. Ranger jumped up after him, then stopped. His body went rigid, ears lifted high, tail still. Not tucked, not wagging. He stared toward the eastern tree line where the island's pines thickened, their needles dark against the bright sky. Adrian followed his gaze. Nothing moved. No footprints. No birds startling, no branches shaking, just a wall of green and shadow. And yet Ranger held himself like a sentry who had just heard a sound over the radio that no one else could hear. Adrian's skin prickled along his arms. He had seen Ranger walk calm through chaos that broke men. He had watched this dog track a threat without noise, without drama, like a professional reading a map in the dark. Ranger didn't do imagination. Adrian swallowed. "Easy," he said, voice low. Ranger didn't look back. He kept listening. A faint click came from above. Adrian froze. His eyes lifted to the light tower mounted near the cabin roofline. It was daytime, a bright, open, safe-looking day. The tower should have been silent, but the metal housing made a small mechanical sound, like a relay switching. Then, impossibly, the light blinked once. Not a full beam, not a steady glow, just a single pulse. Brief, deliberate-like the cabin had recognized his arrival. Adrian stared up, heart giving one hard beat that felt too loud for the quiet air. He told himself it was a loose wire, a solar sensor, an old system catching the sun at the wrong angle. He told himself lots of things. Ranger's ears remained locked east. Adrian looked from the tree line to the blinking tower and felt a cold understanding slide in beneath the summer warmth. This place wasn't asleep. It had been waiting. He climbed the path with Ranger beside him, duffel slung over one shoulder. The trail was edged with stone deliberate markers, half buried in moss and wild grass. Someone had placed them with a pattern in mind. Someone who didn't trust the woods to be kind when weather turned. The cabin door was unlocked. Margaret, even in death, refused the theater of secrets. Inside, the air was cool but clean. Not the stale chill of abandonment, The scent of dry wood and faint smoke lived in the walls. Firewood was stacked neatly by the hearth, sorted by size, the way a person stacks supplies when they expect to need them. A folded blanket rested on the couch, and dust lay so thin it looked like the house had been used yesterday. Adrian set his duffel down and stood still, listening. The cabin creaked once as the structure settled. Sunlight poured through the windows in wide rectangles, illuminating floorboards worn smooth by footsteps. He walked room to room with careful attention, not because he expected danger, but because habit demanded a clear map before he relaxed. A kitchen. Simple. Practical. A table with 2 chairs, as if Margaret had never needed more than one guest at a time. A narrow hallway with hooks for coats, a small loft above, or reachable by a ladder that looked sturdy enough to trust. Everything was in order. And that was the part that unsettled him most. If the cabin had been ruined, he would have known what to do. Repair, replace, rebuild. Ruin had a language he understood. But this felt like being welcomed by someone who wasn't there. Ranger padded across the floor, nails tapping softly. He sniffed the corners, checked the seams beneath the door, then returned to stand between Adrian and the eastern windows. His posture was rigid, but controlled. Guarding not the cabin from Adrian, but Adrian from whatever lay beyond it. Adrian moved to the front window and looked out. The lake glittered. A kayak passed far off, a bright dot on a blue mirror. The world looked peaceful enough to forgive. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt observed not in a threatening way, but in a deliberate one. Like the island was taking inventory. Adrian's throat tightened. What he thought of the city he'd left behind, the people he hadn't answered, the apologies he hadn't made because he didn't know how to make them without sounding like excuses. He had come north to stop being a problem in anyone else's life, to disappear without the cruelty of saying goodbye. But the cabin's clean rooms and waiting firewood said a different thing entirely. Someone had built this place to hold. Adrian turned his head slightly. Ranger's amber eyes met his for a brief moment, steady, unblinking, almost patient. Then the dog looked back toward the trees, ears high, listening for whatever truth moved under the pretty surface of summer. Adrian exhaled slowly. Outside, the lake kept shining like nothing could ever go wrong. Inside, a man who didn't believe in second chances felt the first quiet pressure of one. And on the island, Ranger kept watch toward the east, silent, certain-like he already knew the shape of the winter that would someday come. Morning arrived in a way Adrian didn't trust. It came too clean sun spilling across the lake, like someone had wiped the world down and decided to start over. The water looked impossibly transparent from the cabin window, a sheet of blue that let stone and shadow show through, as if the lake had nothing to hide. Adrian stood at the kitchen sink with a mug of coffee he barely tasted. He watched a kayak cut through the middle distance. The paddle dipped with unhurried rhythm, and each stroke left a soft V in the surface that vanished almost instantly, like the lake refused to hold on to anything. He had spent most of the night half awake, not because of fear, but because his body still believed rest was something you earned only after you'd checked every door twice. Ranger had not slept much either. The German shepherd lay on the floor near the eastern windows, his thick sable coat catching warm light at the edges, cream and gray and black layered like storm clouds that had learned to behave. His amber eyes tracked small changes, a bird landing in a pine, a distant motorboat, the subtle shift of wind through needles. Every now and then, his ears angled in a way that made Adrian pause, as if Ranger was reading messages written into the air. Adrian took a slow breath and tried to let the cabin's order feel like shelter instead of pressure. He moved through the house with a checklist in his head, the same kind of quiet inventory he used to run in unfamiliar buildings. Pantry contents, first aid, tools, exit routes, anything that could break, anything that could burn. The cabin offered him almost nothing to fix, which somehow made him itch. It was clean, stocked, waiting, as if Margaret Hale had stepped out only minutes ago and might return at any moment with a stern look and a wordless expectation. Adrian climbed the short ladder to the loft. Up there, the air was warmer and smelled faintly of cedar. A line of jars sat on a shelf, nails, screws, twine sorted by size and rusted in honest places. A folded tarp. A length of rope coiled with careful attention. Margaret's handwriting appeared on labels in blocky, practical strokes. Near the back wall, he found a small metal box tucked beneath a blanket. It wasn't hidden exactly. It was placed. Inside was a radio older model, heavy as a brick, the kind that could survive a fall and still work out of spite. Beneath it sat a thin notebook bound in dark leather, edges worn smooth by use. Adrian's throat tightened. He carried it downstairs like it might bite. At the kitchen table, he opened the notebook. Margaret's writing was precise, unsentimental, and strangely alive. No poems, no confessions, just observations with the weight of someone who didn't write unless it mattered. Wind direction over the lake. Sudden fog banks that rolled in without warning. Places where ice thinned first in winter. Routes marked by stones because compasses had a habit of acting foolish near the eastern ridge. A note, underlined once, read, "Sound lies when the wind comes from the east." Adrian stared at the sentence longer than he meant to. His mind offered him the memory he tried not to keep. A night overseas when the noise had shifted wrong, when the first blast had come from a direction that should have been safe. He'd trusted what he heard. He'd moved the wrong way. And someone else had paid for that fraction of a second. He closed his eyes and pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. Ranger rose and came to him without being called. The dog's head nudged Adrian's knee, gentle pressure, as if Ranger could feel the way his thoughts had turned sharp and wanted to pull him back to the present. Adrian exhaled slowly. "I'm fine," he murmured. Ranger's tail thumped once, not convinced. Outside, the lake glittered like a promise. Inside, Adrian felt the old discomfort of being needed by something that didn't care whether he felt ready. He forced himself into motion. He checked the generator shed at the back of the cabin, found fuel stored properly, the way someone kept it when they expected storms. He tested the breaker panel and traced wires with his eyes. Everything looked solid. Overbuilt, even. Margaret had built for winter. He returned to the porch and scanned the island's perimeter. The island wasn't large granite rising low from the lake. She ringed with short pines and scrub that clung stubbornly to rock. A narrow footpath threaded around the cabin, marked here and there with stones set like punctuation. Someone had designed this place with intention. Adrian followed the path clockwise, Ranger beside him like a shadow that decided to be loyal. At the eastern edge, the air changed. It wasn't dramatic. Nothing howled. Nothing snapped. But the wind slid across the island with a different texture cooler. Thinner, carrying a faint scent Adrian couldn't place. Not rot, not smoke. Something mineral, like wet stone pulled from deep water. Ranger slowed. His posture shifted ears forward, body angled slightly between Adrian and the tree line. Not fear. Focus. Adrian's hand moved automatically to the handle on Ranger's harness, not gripping, just ready. The ground here looked normal, a light dusting of pine needles, sparse grass, rock that felt firm underfoot. And yet Ranger stopped. He planted his paws and refused to take another step. Adrian frowned. He picked up a fallen branch and used it to test the ground ahead, tapping lightly where the path seemed to continue. The branch struck something hollow-sounding and sank an inch into a crust that didn't belong. Adrian's chest tightened. He prodded again, harder this time. The surface gave snowmelt, pooled over a thin shelf of rock, hiding a narrow crevice that dropped straight down into black water at the edge. One careless step, and he would have gone through. Ranger sat down calmly, as if to say, "We're done here." Adrian let out a breath that turned into a short, humorless laugh. "Okay," he muttered. "You noticed first." Ranger's ears flicked, but he didn't look smug. He just waited. Adrian backed away slowly and followed the path back toward the cabin, unease threading through him like a thin wire. Margaret's notebook felt heavier in his mind now. This place wasn't just pretty, it was precise. It punished mistakes. And someone Margaret had chosen to live here anyway. By midday, the sun warmed the cabin's front steps. Adrian ate, standing up, a protein bar he didn't want, then forced himself to take the boat back toward shore to buy supplies he couldn't ignore. Fresh food, extra fuel, medical basics. The marina sat in a pocket of trees, small and functional, smelling of gasoline and lakeweed. A few locals moved quietly, their faces sun-browned, their conversations low. Adrian didn't blend in the way he'd hoped. Even in civilian clothes, he carried himself like someone who'd learned to move with purpose. His clean-shaven face and calm gray-blue eyes made people glance twice, as if trying to place him in a memory. Ranger drew looks two-part admiration, part caution. A working dog's posture had a gravity that made people step around him without being asked. At the small supply counter, a man in his early 30s looked up from a clipboard. He was lean, was weather-hardened, with sandy blonde hair cut short, and a face carved by sun and wind rather than age. His eyes were sharp and practical. A radio sat clipped to his belt, and his green Ranger jacket had faded slightly at the shoulders from years of wear. Deputy Ranger Cole Mercer. Adrian recognized him from the name on the paperwork. Mercer's gaze flicked to the key ring in Adrian's hand, then to Ranger. Something in his expression softened, not into friendliness exactly, but into recognition. "You're Margaret Hale's grandson," Mercer said. His voice was steady, not loud, the tone of someone who'd learned not to waste words on the lake. Adrian nodded once. "Adrian." Mercer's eyes traveled past Adrian toward the lake, as if the island was visible even from here. "Didn't think anyone would take that place on," he said, almost to himself. "Wasn't much choice," Adrian replied. Mercer snorted lightly, the hint of humor you get from people who've seen too much weather. That island gives everyone a choice. They just don't always know it yet." Adrian didn't answer. He bought supplies, paid in cash, avoided small talk. Mercer watched him do it all, as if measuring the distance Adrian kept between himself and everyone else. When Adrian stepped outside, Mercer followed. The sunlight on the dock was bright enough to make the lake glare. A family loaded a canoe. Two teenagers argued about fishing lures. The world looked harmless. Mercer stopped at the edge of the planks. "You should know," he said. "Margaret kept that light tower working on purpose. She didn't do things out of habit. She did them because they mattered. Adrian held the boat rope and kept his gaze on the water. "It's summer," he said. "Nobody needs a light tower in summer." Mercer's mouth tightened. "People get careless in summer," he replied. "They think clear water means safe water." Adrian felt the words land like a stone in his chest because they sounded too much like a lesson he'd learned the hard way. Mercer continued, quieter. "We don't put that cabin on public maps. Too many folks would treat it like a vacation spot and turn it into a problem. But locals know. When weather turns, they look for that light. When fog rolls in and sound goes sideways, they remember the island." Adrian's grip on the rope tightened. "I'm not running a shelter," he said. Mercer didn't argue. He just studied Adrian's face with the calm persistence of someone who had waited out many storms. "Nobody asked you to," he said. "Not officially." He glanced down at Ranger. The dog stood still, watching Mercer with amber-eyed focus. Mercer's expression changed again, briefly, like a door cracking open. "That dog, working line?" Adrian nodded. "He's retired, but he doesn't know it." Mercer let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh. "Yeah," he said. "I've met that type." Adrian didn't smile, but something eased in his shoulders. Mercer stepped back. "Just keep the light in mind," he said. "Margaret did." Adrian climbed into the boat without responding. Ranger jumped in after him, settled at the bow, eyes forward. As Adrian guided the boat across the lake, the island rose again dark granite under bright sky. The cabin looked steady, waiting in the sunlight like it had never known doubt. Adrian's mind kept circling Mercer's words. People look for that light. He reached the dock and began unloading supplies. He was halfway up the path when Ranger stopped again. Not east this time. He turned toward the cabin and sat, staring at the front steps. Adrian frowned. "What is it?" Ranger didn't move. A moment later, Adrian heard it too, a soft, rhythmic sound from inside. Not mechanical. Not wind. A faint tapping, like knuckles on wood. Adrian froze. No one should have been there. He set the box of supplies down carefully, every muscle tightening into quiet readiness. The old instinct returned. Scan, listen, locate, control your breath. Ranger's ears were forward, his body still but coiled. The tapping came again. 3 slow knocks. Then nothing. Adrian took a step toward the door, heart steady in the way it always got when fear became focus. He reached for the handle. The door was locked. He knew it was locked because he had locked it. Adrian stared at the latch as if it might explain itself. Ranger let out a single low huff, not a growl, more like a warning meant only for Adrian. Adrian swallowed once, then slid the key into the lock. He turned it slowly. The door opened to cool air and silence. No footsteps. No shifting shadows. No sign of anyone. Just the clean cabin, sunlit floorboards, and the smell of wood. Adrian stepped inside, Ranger close at his heel. The tapping did not return. On the kitchen table, where Adrian had left Margaret's notebook open earlier, a page had been turned. Adrian knew it had been turned because the notebook now lay open to a different entry one he hadn't read yet. The paper looked slightly lifted, as if moved by a hand rather than a breeze. At the top of the page, in Margaret's blunt, steady handwriting, was a line that made Adrian's stomach drop. "If the dog won't cross, don't make him." The lake collects pride. Adrian stared at the sentence until the words blurred. He hadn't told anyone about the eastern edge. Mercer didn't know what Ranger had done. Nobody had been here to see it. And yet the notebook was open to the warning that matched the moment exactly, like Margaret had anticipated this day, this arrival, this exact, stubborn man, and the dog who knew better. Adrian's throat tightened. For the first time since he'd stepped onto the island, he felt something that wasn't just unease. He felt watched over, not by a threat, by a presence with an opinion. Adrian set the supplies down and walked through the cabin again, checking every room, every corner, and every place someone could hide. Nothing. He checked the loft. Nothing. He checked the windows and the back door. All secure. He returned to the kitchen and stared at the notebook. "Okay," he said softly, to no one in particular. Ranger stood beside him, eyes on the doorway, as if the cabin itself had ears. Adrian looked at the dog's harness, at the worn handle that had saved him more than once, and the faint red trim that looked like a heartbeat against black. He thought of Mercer's words, of Margaret's rules, of the way the island punished mistakes. He thought of his own habit of leaving before anyone could ask him to stay. Adrian reached out and closed the notebook carefully, not as an act of denial, but as if he were acknowledging it was real. Then he walked to the breaker panel and checked the light tower circuit again, making sure it was stable. He didn't switch it on. Not yet. But he didn't disconnect it either. Evening slid in slowly, and the lake turned darker blue, then steel, reflecting the lowering sun. A canoe passed in the distance, silhouettes soft against the water, laughter faint but present. Ranger resumed his position near the eastern windows as the wind shifted slightly. Adrian cooked a simple meal, ate at the table, and found himself listening, not for danger, but for meaning. He sat with his hands flat on the wood and felt the island's quiet settle around him like a decision waiting to be made. He had inherited a cabin. He had not yet decided what else he'd inherited. Outside, the water stayed calm. Inside, something older than comfort held the space like a held breath. Adrian stood at the window and watched the last light fade. Ranger's ears angled east. Adrian didn't argue with the dog. He just stayed. The storm did not announce itself with thunder. It arrived as a shift. Adrian noticed it first in the way the air thickened around noon, the bright blue of the lake dulling into a harder shade, as if someone had drawn a thin veil across the sky. The sunlight remained, but it felt strained, too sharp, too metallic. Ranger felt it before Adrian named it. The German shepherd had been resting on the porch, forelegs stretched forward, chin resting between them. His sable coat shimmered in the light cream underbelly, gray-black saddle along his back, darker streaks at the shoulders like brush marks from a careful painter. When the wind shifted, his head rose instantly. Not alert in alarm, alert in recognition. Adrian stood near the railing, arms folded, watching a small motorboat drift farther from shore than it should have. And a couple sat inside at late 60s, perhaps early 70s. The man handled the tiller with stiff determination. The woman sat beside him, a sun hat tied loosely beneath her chin. Their movements were slow, but deliberate. They were dressed for summer. The lake was not. A ripple cut across the surface at an odd angle. Adrian narrowed his eyes. Margaret's notebook had not described storms as dramatic events. It described them as adjustments, pressure moving, currents changing, wind rethinking its direction. The motorboat's engine sputtered. Adrian felt something in his chest tighten. "Ranger," he said quietly. The dog was already standing. The engine coughed once more, then died. The wind came next, not fierce, but insistent. It pushed sideways across the lake in a way that seemed gentle until you watched the boat begin to turn where it shouldn't. Adrian did not hesitate. He moved without rush but without doubt. Rope from the dock. Was life ring from the post. The small motorboat untied in 3 practiced motions. Ranger jumped in before being told, paws landing steady despite the rocking hull. Adrian clipped a secondary line to the harness handle, not to restrain him, but to ensure contact if things went wrong. He guided the boat toward the drifting couple. Up close, they looked more fragile than from shore. The man had the posture of someone who'd once been broad-shouldered and capable. His hair was white and neatly combed, his face lined deeply around the mouth from decades of tight smiles and stubborn decisions. His jaw trembled slightly, not from fear, but from cold creeping into joints that no longer adapted quickly. The woman beside him was thin, her skin pale with the translucence of age. Wisps of silver hair had slipped from beneath her hat. Her hands gripped the side of the boat, knuckles sharp, eyes wide in a way that betrayed her calm. "We're fine," the man called out, though the engine behind him was clearly not. Thus Adrian cut his own motor and drifted close enough to toss the rope. "You're not fine," he replied, voice level. "Let's get you tied off." The wind caught the smaller boat and swung it unexpectedly. Ranger braced himself, weight low, eyes tracking movement like a calculation. Adrian stepped carefully onto the drifting boat once it was secured, testing balance before committing weight. The old reflex returned control center of gravity. Keep your line clear. Protect the vulnerable first. He reached for the woman's arm. Her skin felt cold through the thin fabric of her blouse. "How long have you been out?" he asked. "Just a little while," she said, but her lips had begun to pale. The man frowned at Adrian. "Engine's been reliable for 30 years, he muttered. "Never did this before." Adrian nodded once. "Machines age," he said. "Water doesn't forgive that." The words weren't meant to sting, but the man's jaw tightened anyway. Ranger moved forward carefully, placing himself between the couple and the shifting side of the boat. His amber eyes met the woman's. He leaned lightly against her leg, not pushing, not crowding, just enough to steady. Her breath hitched. "Oh," she whispered. "He's warm." Adrian glanced at Ranger and felt a flicker of something that wasn't tactical. He secured the rope and guided both boats back toward the island. The wind pressed harder now, not violent but directional, nudging them toward the eastern side of the lake. Adrian adjusted instinctively, steering against it. The dock came into view like a held breath finally released. He helped the couple step onto solid wood. The woman's knees buckled slightly. Ranger shifted position again, offering balance without being asked. Inside the cabin, the air felt warmer than it had an hour ago. Adrian moved efficiently, blanket from the couch, kettle on the stove, dry towels laid out. He guided them to the table, sat them down. The woman's name was Helen Carter, no relation to him, she clarified quickly, with a faint, embarrassed smile. Her husband was Thomas Carter, retired machinist from a town 20 miles south. Thomas had the hands of someone who'd spent a lifetime building things thick fingers, nails permanently ridged. He carried himself with pride, the kind that resisted help until it was already needed. "I told her the lake was calm," Thomas said quietly, staring at his hands. It looked calm. Helen reached over and placed her thin hand over his. "It was," she said softly. "Until it wasn't." Adrian poured warm water into mugs, added a pinch of salt the way he'd learned to ease shock. He kept his voice even. "Storm fronts move fast here," he said. "They don't always look like storms." Thomas nodded once, but his eyes drifted toward the window, toward the water. "Margaret used to keep that light on," Helen said suddenly, glancing up at Adrian. Even in summer. When we'd see it sometimes and laugh. Thought she was dramatic. Adrian didn't answer immediately. Was she? He asked. Helen's expression changed, softened, then tightened. No, she said. She was careful. As if in response to the word, Ranger stood abruptly. He moved away from the couple and positioned himself near the eastern wall, head tilted slightly upward, ears sharp and still. The kettle had stopped whistling. The cabin was quiet. Too quiet. Adrian felt it again, that subtle shift, not loud enough to name, but heavy enough to feel. Outside the window, the water near the eastern ridge had darkened, not from shadow, but from movement beneath the surface. A long, slow ripple traveled against the wind's direction, cutting the lake in a line that didn't belong. Thomas noticed it too. That's not right, he muttered. Adrian stepped closer to the glass. For a moment, a fraction of a moment, he thought he saw something break the surface beyond the ridge. Not an object, not debris. A current. A narrow path of disturbance moving where no boat had passed. Then it was gone. Ranger let out a low breath. Not a growl, not fear, just acknowledgement. Adrian felt his heartbeat steady rather than spike. This wasn't chaos. It was information. The lake was speaking in the only language it had, and Margaret had learned to listen. The ripple faded, the wind eased slightly. Adrian turned back to the Carters. "You'll stay here until it settles," he said. Not a question. Thomas opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again. His shoulders lowered just enough to betray the relief he didn't want to admit. Helen studied Adrian more carefully now. "You've done this before," she said. Adrian met her gaze. "Something like it." She didn't press. They sat at the table while the storm passed in degrees. The wind tested the cabin's walls. The roof creaked once, but held. Ranger resumed his position near the couple, it lying down close enough that Helen could rest her hand lightly in his fur. Thomas eventually allowed himself to ask, "You planning to live here?" Adrian considered the question. "I inherited it," he said. "That's not what I asked," Thomas replied, with the stubborn directness of a man who had spent decades correcting machinery until it behaved. Adrian looked at the wood grain of the table. "I haven't decided," he admitted. Thomas nodded slowly, as if the answer confirmed something he'd suspected. "Places like this," he said quietly, "they don't ask you to decide. They wait until you do." The storm loosened its grip over the next hour. Sunlight filtered back in, softer now, almost apologetic. The lake smoothed itself, pretending it had never shifted at all. Adrian walked the couple back to their boat once the engine restarted under his supervision. Thomas gripped his hand longer than necessary. "You saved us trouble," he said. Adrian shook his head once. "You steered wrong. That's all." Helen smiled faintly. "We steered where it was pretty," she said. Adrian watched them head back toward shore, their boat moving slower, more deliberate this time. Ranger stood beside him, ears relaxed now. The island felt different, not lighter, more aware. Adrian returned to the cabin and closed the door behind him. He stood in the center of the room and listened, not for danger, but for alignment. The generator hummed faintly in the back shed. The kettle cooled on the stove. The lake lapped gently at granite. He walked to the breaker panel and rested his hand on the switch connected to the light tower. He didn't flip it, not yet. But he imagined what it would look like at dusk, a steady beam against gathering fog. Not as a signal of fear, as a refusal to let others guess in the dark. Ranger stepped up beside him and leaned lightly against his leg. Adrian looked down at the dog's face, the steady amber gaze, the quiet intelligence that never rushed judgment. "You noticed before I did," Adrian said softly. Ranger's tail moved once. Adrian felt something shift inside him. Not obligation, not guilt. Responsibility. Not forced. Chosen. Outside, the lake settled into calm. Inside, Adrian understood that instinct alone wasn't enough. You had to act on it. He turned away from the breaker panel and instead walked to the porch. Evening stretched gold across the water. He stood there with Ranger at his side, watching the last light slide along the ridge. The island didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like a question waiting for an answer. Adrian didn't speak. He didn't need to. He stayed. Autumn did not arrive all at once. It thinned the air first. The mornings sharpened. The lake's blue deepened into something darker, more reflective. The kayaks disappeared one by one until the water lay undisturbed for hours at a time, as if it had withdrawn from being admired. Adrian noticed it in the silence. Summer had carried laughter across the surface. Now the only sounds were wind through pine needles and the low hush of water against granite. The island seemed to stand taller without the distraction of color. He spent his days working without calling it preparation. He reinforced the shutters, checked the seals around the windows, inspected the generator again, cleaned the intake, replaced a worn filter. He marked a rough line from the dock toward the mainland shore with reflective stakes. In setting them deep into the rock at intervals Margaret's notebook suggested were safest once ice formed. He did not call it responsibility. He called it maintenance. Ranger moved with him like a second pair of instincts. The German shepherd's coat thickened as the temperature dropped, his underfur growing denser, sable colors deepening in the cold light. His amber eyes seemed brighter against the gray sky, and his patrols around the island grew more deliberate. At dusk, he no longer lay near the porch steps. He positioned himself at the eastern side of the cabin. Muscles relaxed, but ready, ears angled toward the ridge. Adrian pretended not to notice the pattern. One afternoon, the sound of a motor approached from shore. Steady, purposeful. Deputy Ranger Cole Mercer stepped onto the dock without hesitation. In colder weather, Mercer looked different. The Green Ranger jacket he wore now had a heavier lining, the fabric darkened by damp wind. A knit cap pulled low over sandy blonde hair emphasized the angular structure of his face. His jaw carried faint stubble today, not neglect, just the mark of long hours. His eyes were sharp as ever, but there was fatigue there too, the kind earned by men who spend their days watching for mistakes others don't know they're making. "You've been busy," Mercer said, scanning the reflective stakes. Adrian wiped his hands on a rag. "Didn't like the look of the shoreline." Mercer walked along the edge, boot heels firm on granite. "Forecast's shifting," he said. "First real front comes through next week. Might freeze early." Adrian nodded once. Mercer paused near the eastern ridge and glanced at Ranger. The dog stood upright, gaze fixed on the tree line, body angled slightly toward the lake. "He always do that?" Mercer asked quietly. "Lately," Adrian replied. Mercer studied the horizon. "Margaret used to say the east side lies first." Adrian didn't answer. Mercer shifted his weight, boots grinding lightly against stone. "Look," he said, voice lowering, "when the snow hits, we'll have folks who think the lake's a highway. Happens every year. Ice looks solid. Then it isn't. Adrian kept his eyes on the cabin roofline. I'm not running a rescue post, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Mercer didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and handed Adrian a laminated sheet local weather emergency frequencies, marked in pen. Not asking you to, Mercer said. Just don't shut yourself off. He turned to leave, then stopped. And don't trust how quiet it gets before the first big storm. That quiet's not peace. The boat engine started, faded, and the island returned to its own breathing. The wind shifted 3 days later. It didn't howl, it slid. A thin current of air moved from the east across the lake, cutting the surface into faint lines that only someone watching too closely would notice. Ranger noticed. He rose from his place near the hearth and stood facing the door. An ears high, tail still. Adrian felt it too, not in his skin, but in his bones. A subtle pressure, like the moment before a decision becomes irreversible. He stepped onto the porch. The lake looked ordinary. Gray water under gray sky. But the air carried a hollow quality, as if sound had traveled too far and come back wrong. He clapped once, experimentally. The echo returned late, distorted, as though the trees had debated where to send it. Adrian's jaw tightened. Margaret's words surfaced without invitation. Sound lies when the wind comes from the east. He didn't like how easily memory overlaid the present. He went back inside and checked the radio Mercer had given him. Static hissed. Then a clipped voice from Shore Weather Advisory. Pressure drop. Early freeze warning. Adrian shut it off. The cabin felt smaller now, not confined. Focused. Near dusk, Ranger did something he had never done before. He walked to the breaker panel and sat directly beneath it. Not facing the door, not facing the east. Facing the switch that controlled the light tower. He didn't whine, didn't bark, didn't paw. He simply sat there, eyes lifted toward Adrian, steady and expectant. Adrian stared back. The dog's gaze held no urgency, only certainty. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls with a quiet insistence. For a long moment, Adrian did nothing. Then he stepped forward and rested his hand on the switch. He did not flip it. Not yet. But he felt the weight of the decision in a way that surprised him. Ranger held his position until Adrian's hand dropped away. Only then did he move. Night fell early. The temperature dropped sharply enough that the lake's surface developed a thin, deceptive sheen near the shallows. Ice formed in fragile patches that looked solid from a distance and lethal up close. Adrian stood at the window long after dark, watching the line where the eastern ridge blurred into shadow. And he thought of the mission he didn't talk about, the one where he'd trusted a sound that came from the wrong direction, the one where he'd moved a team into a corridor that should have been clear. He saw again the split second of confusion, the blast, the silence after. Responsibility had weight. It had edges. He had left the service because he could no longer tell whether his instincts protected or endangered the people beside him. Now the island was asking him to trust them again. A sharp knock sounded on the door. Adrian's body reacted before thought caught up. He moved quickly, controlled, hand instinctively reaching for a weapon he no longer carried. Ranger was already at the threshold, posture tall, not aggressive alert. Adrian opened the door. A woman stood on the porch, wind cutting her dark hair across her face. She was in her early 40s, tall and spare, built with the kind of strength that came from endurance rather than gym hours. And her coat was practical gray blue, weathered at the cuffs, A canvas medical bag hung from her shoulder. Her eyes were a muted green, steady even in cold light. "Elena Ward," she said. Her voice was low, controlled. "Mercer said I might find you here." Adrian stepped aside. Elena entered without hesitation, scanning the room in a single sweep the way someone trained to assess spaces does. Her gaze paused briefly on Ranger. "That's a working dog," she observed. "He was," Adrian replied. Elena's mouth twitched slightly. "They don't stop." She removed her gloves and set the medical bag on the table. "I used to run search and rescue on this lake," she said, "back when Margaret still climbed those stairs faster than anyone half her age." Adrian studied her more carefully now. There were faint lines at the corners of her eyes, not from age, but from squinting into wind and snow. A small scar traced along her left forearm, old and clean. While she moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had held pressure on wounds and counted breaths in the dark. "Used to?" Adrian asked. Elena's gaze shifted toward the window. "Lost someone," she said simply. "Storm moved faster than we did." The words sat between them without decoration. "I heard about the Carters," she continued. "You handled it right." Adrian felt the familiar resistance rise in his chest. "It was nothing," he said. Elena's eyes sharpened. "It's never nothing," she replied. Ranger stepped closer to her, sniffed once at the hem of her coat, then sat. Elena lowered a hand, letting him inspect her fingers. "You smell things before they happen, don't you?" she murmured. Ranger blinked slowly. Elena straightened. "The first real winter storm won't wait for your comfort," she said. "If you're staying here, you need a plan, not pride." Adrian didn't respond immediately. The wind struck the side of the cabin with a harder push. He looked at the breaker panel again, then at the light tower outside, barely visible against the darkening sky. "I haven't decided," he said quietly. Elena nodded once. "You don't have to decide tonight," she said, "but winter will decide for you." She left before full dark, moving back toward shore with deliberate steps. Adrian closed the door behind her. Inside, the cabin held warmth against the pressing cold. Ranger resumed his post by the eastern wall. Adrian stood in the center of the room, feeling the shift inside him. Not fear, not obligation. Recognition. The island had not asked him to be heroic. It had asked him to be present. He walked to the breaker panel once more. His hand hovered over the switch. He imagined snow swallowing the shoreline. Ice stretching unbroken from island to mainland. A traveler misjudging distance in whiteout conditions. He imagined the moment when someone lifted their head and searched for a point of reference. Adrian flipped the switch. Outside, the light tower came alive. Not dramatic, not blinding, just a steady, unwavering beam cutting across the dark. Ranger's ears relaxed. Adrian stepped onto the porch and looked at the light spilling over frozen water. It wasn't about being ready. It was about being there. The wind continued from the east. The lake answered with quiet movement beneath forming ice. Inside the cabin, warmth held. And for the first time since arriving, Adrian did not feel like he was waiting to leave. He felt like he had chosen to stay. The storm did not build itself politely. It arrived ahead of forecast, erasing distance first. Adrian knew something was wrong before the first hard gust struck the cabin. The air felt compressed dense in the lungs, metallic on the tongue. The lake, already locked in early ice along its shallows, had gone from reflective steel to something opaque and waiting. By mid-afternoon, the horizon had dissolved. Snow did not fall in soft flakes. It drove sideways in fine, relentless sheets that flattened depth and swallowed reference points. The mainland shore disappeared. The sky and ground merged into a single, disorienting field of white. Inside the cabin, the light tower burned steady. Adrian stood near the eastern window, shoulders squared, watching visibility collapse to nothing. Ranger did not pace. He stood still, head slightly lowered, and ears angled forward as if listening to something deeper than wind. His thick winter coat had reached full density now, sable fur layered and heavy, protecting muscle and bone beneath. His amber eyes held focus without fear. Adrian checked the generator one last time. Fuel secure. Intake clear. Backup batteries charged. He moved through the cabin in deliberate rhythm, reinforcing shutters, securing loose items, laying out blankets and medical supplies near the hearth. A pot of soup simmered low on the stove, not for comfort, but for calories. The radio crackled. Static first, then a clipped voice he recognized, Cole Mercer. "Adrian, you copy?" Adrian lifted the handset. "Copy." Wind howled across the frequency, distorting the edges of Mercer's voice. "3 overdue," Mercer said. "College kids, snowmobiling North Ridge. Signal lost 30 minutes ago." Adrian's jaw tightened. "Last ping?" he asked. "East quadrant," Mercer replied. "Close to your markers." Adrian's eyes flicked toward Ranger. The dog was already facing the door. "Understood," Adrian said. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He set the radio down and reached for his coat. The tactical combat shirt clung warm beneath layers, worn olive fabric creasing at the shoulders. The red thermal layer beneath caught the light briefly as he pulled on a heavier outer shell. Combat pants tucked into scuffed work boots. Military watch tightened at his wrist. Every motion felt familiar, not as a soldier this time, but as someone choosing to step into weather instead of hiding from it. He clipped a safety line to Ranger's harness. The black strap with its dark red trim stood out against the white that seeped through every crack in the window. Ranger didn't resist. He braced. Adrian opened the door. The wind struck like a living thing, sharp, biting, intent on pushing him back inside. A snow burned his exposed skin and stole breath mid-inhale. For a split second, the world narrowed to instinct. Then Ranger moved. Not blindly. Not rushing. He angled left, paws finding grip where Adrian's boots slid. He kept tension on the line without jerking it, guiding rather than pulling. Adrian followed. They moved along the reflective stakes Adrian had set weeks earlier. Even now, half buried in snow, the faint glint of each marker caught what little light remained. Beyond the last stake, the world became guesswork. Adrian lowered his center of gravity and let Ranger dictate pace. He trusted the dog's nose over his own eyes. 10 minutes into the whiteout, Ranger stopped abruptly. Adrian nearly collided with him. The dog's posture shifted. Not panic, not confusion, but a focused forward lean. His ears flattened slightly against the wind, and his head angled downward toward what looked like nothing more than a drift. Adrian squinted through the snow. He heard it then. Not a shout. Not a scream. A thin, ragged exhale that didn't belong to the wind. Ranger lunged forward and began digging, measured, urgent strokes of his paws flinging powder aside. A gloved hand emerged from the snow. Still. Adrian's chest constricted. He dropped to his knees, clearing snow with both hands. A young man lay beneath the drift, face pale against the storm. His helmet had rolled aside, snow crusted into his dark hair. He couldn't have been older than 21. His lips were tinged blue. Adrian checked his airway, then pulse-weak, but present. "Stay with me," Adrian muttered, though he didn't know if the kid could hear. Ranger shifted position immediately, lowering his body against the young man's side, transferring heat without crowding. Adrian wrapped the boy in his own outer layer and clipped the line tighter. 1 down, 2 to find. They pressed forward, and visibility fluctuated between 3 feet and nothing. Ranger veered right suddenly, circling. Adrian followed the tension on the line. He found the second student kneeling beside a snowmobile half buried in drift. A young woman, mid-20s, dark hair escaping from beneath her helmet, cheeks raw with windburn. Her eyes were wide, pupils blown with panic. "I can't see," she kept repeating. "I can't see." Her voice trembled not from cold alone, but from the kind of fear that fractures direction. Adrian crouched in front of her. "You don't need to see," he said evenly. "You need to follow." She stared at him, at his clean-shaven jaw set against the storm, at the calm in his gray-blue eyes that refused to rush her. "I'm Adrian," he said. "That's Ranger. You're not alone." The words cut through her spiraling breath just enough to anchor it. He secured her to the line behind him. 2. The third took longer. The storm intensified, wind shifting angles unpredictably. Adrian felt the old edge of doubt creep in, the whisper that asked if he had misjudged direction again. Ranger stopped once more, lifted his head high, and gave a single sharp bark into the wind. Adrian froze. He heard it faintly metal against ice. A snowmobile tipped sideways against a ridge. Behind it, partially shielded, a third student lay slumped. A young woman, barely out of college, light brown hair frozen against her collar, face ashen, her breathing shallow and uneven. Ranger lay immediately against her legs, his body blocking wind. Adrian worked, quickly checking responsiveness, clearing ice from her face. Her eyelids fluttered. "I'm tired," she whispered. "I know," Adrian replied, voice steady. "But we're moving." He secured her to the line as well, creating a slow chain back toward the island. Each step back was a negotiation with the storm. Adrian's injured shoulder burned beneath layers, and his knee protested in sharp pulses of pain he ignored. Snow packed into the folds of his pants, boots slipping once before catching. Ranger maintained a diagonal lead, adjusting course instinctively when wind threatened to push them toward thinner ice. At the edge of the reflective stakes, Adrian nearly stumbled. For a fraction of a second, his mind replayed that corridor overseas, the moment he'd moved left when he should have moved right. His grip tightened. "Not this time," he muttered under his breath. The light tower's beam cut faintly through the snow ahead, a steady line in chaos. The cabin door appeared like a wall rising from white. Inside, warmth felt almost violent after the cold. Adrian shut the door against the storm and moved into practiced sequence. Wet layers stripped carefully. Blankets layered gradually, no sudden heat against frozen skin. Warm fluids in small sips, monitoring breath. The first young man coughed weakly. The second student's panic eased once Ranger settled near her feet, his steady presence grounding her breath. The third girl's color returned in uneven patches across her cheeks. The cabin filled with bodies and visible breath. Mercer's voice came over the radio again, strained, relieved when Adrian confirmed all 3 accounted for. "Hold them there," Mercer said. "Roads are impassable tonight." Adrian set the radio down. The storm outside roared like something offended. Inside, the light from the hearth and the tower outside held steady. The young woman who had panicked earlier, Her name was Mia, she told him in fragments watched Ranger, with wonder. He didn't leave, she whispered, fingers curling into his thick fur. No, Adrian said quietly. He doesn't. The third girl, Hannah, sat wrapped in a blanket, eyes wide but present. I thought, she began, then stopped. What? Adrian asked gently. I thought I was going to disappear, she said. Adrian looked at the steady beam cutting through the storm beyond the window. You didn't, he said. Hours later, the storm's fury dulled. Bodies crowded the cabin 3 students, Adrian, Ranger. Soup passed from hand to hand. Silence shared without awkwardness. No one spoke of how close it had come. They didn't need to. Adrian stepped onto the porch once before midnight. Snow still fell, softer now. The lake lay invisible beneath it, but the light tower carved a path across what could not be seen. Ranger joined him, pressing lightly against his leg. Adrian rested his hand briefly on the dog's head. He understood something now that he hadn't before. It wasn't about being fearless. It wasn't even about being capable. It was about standing where someone might look when they had nowhere else to turn. Behind him, 3 young voices breathed steadily. Ahead of him, winter pressed against granite and glass. The light stayed on. And for the first time since he'd left the service, Adrian did not feel like a man who had failed to choose. He felt like someone who had answered. Morning after a storm is never loud. It arrives carefully, as if testing whether anything survived the night. Adrian stepped onto the porch just after dawn. The world had been reshaped. Snow lay in sculpted drifts along the granite, smooth and untouched, except for the faint depressions where wind had clawed and retreated. The lake was no longer visible as water. It had hardened into a wide, white plain, broken only by the thin, steady beam of the light tower that still cut across it like a line drawn by intent. Behind him, inside the cabin, 3 young voices breathed in unison. Sleeping now, color returned, lives intact. Ranger stood at Adrian's side, shoulder brushing his thigh, amber eyes scanning the horizon in small, precise movements. His coat was dusted with frost that glittered faintly in the pale light. He looked less like a pet than a sentinel carved from winter itself. Adrian inhaled deeply. The air burned clean in his lungs. For a moment, there was no past. No echo of corridors. No weight of decisions gone wrong. There was only this island, this cabin, this quiet. Then the low hum of a snowmobile reached him from shore. Deputy Ranger Cole Mercer arrived first, his machine cutting a careful line along the marked path Adrian had set weeks ago. Mercer moved differently after a storm, more alert, more assessing. He killed the engine and removed his helmet, revealing wind-reddened skin and sandy blonde hair flattened by static and cold. You got them all, Mercer said, not as a question. Adrian nodded once. Mercer's jaw tightened briefly, not in tension, but in relief. He refused to dramatize. Parents are on their way, he added. Within the hour, more engines followed. A second snowmobile appeared, driven by a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s. He dismounted before the engine fully died. Mark Ellison. His face bore the imprint of sleeplessness, dark crescents under his eyes, stubble shadowing his jaw. His build suggested a life spent working with his hands' solid forearms, shoulders shaped by lifting more than ambition. But beneath that strength was something frayed. Behind him rode a woman with a posture that defied exhaustion. Laura Ellison stepped off the machine slowly, tall and slender, her dark brown hair braided tightly to keep it from her face. Her skin was pale from worry rather than cold, and her eyes, hazel, rimmed red, searched the cabin door before anything else. She did not ask where her daughter was. She simply moved. Adrian opened the door before she reached it. Inside, Hannah was awake now, sitting upright under a blanket, cheeks flushed from warmth. When she saw her mother, the stiffness in her shoulders dissolved all at once. Laura crossed the room in 3 strides and wrapped her daughter without hesitation. And not gently, completely. Mark followed more slowly. He stopped just inside the threshold, eyes scanning the space before settling on Adrian. "You're him," Mark said quietly. Adrian didn't ask what that meant. "I'm Adrian," he replied. Mark nodded once. "Thank you," he said. The words were simple, but his voice carried the weight of a man who had imagined burying his child under snow. Mia's parents arrived next, quieter, more contained. Her father, Daniel Reyes, was shorter than Mark, but compact with controlled intensity. His dark hair was flecked with early gray at the temples. He shook Adrian's hand with both of his, grip firm but not crushing. Her mother, Isabel Reyes, stood back for a moment before stepping forward. She had the posture of someone who had spent years organizing chaos into order, shoulders straight, movements efficient. When she finally hugged her daughter, she did so with trembling restraint. And the third young man, Evan, was claimed by a pair of older parents who held him as if he might still vanish. The cabin filled with voices, gratitude, and the awkward choreography of relief. Adrian stood slightly apart. He was not uncomfortable. He simply did not know where to place himself in moments that belonged to families. Ranger, however, moved freely. He approached each student in turn, nudging hands, leaning lightly against legs, accepting touch without demanding it. When Hannah buried her fingers in his thick fur once more, Ranger closed his eyes briefly, content but vigilant. Mercer stepped closer to Adrian. "They'll talk," Mercer said under his breath. "Small towns don't forget nights like this." Adrian exhaled slowly. "That's not what I'm after." Mercer studied him. "Doesn't matter what you're after," he replied. "It's what the island is." By afternoon, the snowmobiles had departed. The lake lay vast and silent once more. Adrian began cleaning the cabin, restoring order to blankets and supplies. He moved methodically, as if erasing evidence of crisis. Ranger followed, occasionally pausing near the eastern wall. It was during this quiet that a new engine approached. Slower, less urgent. Elena Ward arrived without haste. She removed her helmet and shook loose a strand of dark hair that had escaped her cap. Her face was weather-marked but steady, the faint scar along her forearm visible when she adjusted her gloves. "You kept them warm," she said, after scanning the interior. Adrian nodded. Elena moved through the room, checking leftover supplies with professional eyes. "You didn't overheat them," she noted approvingly. "Most people panic and do that." Adrian shrugged. "Panic doesn't help." Elena glanced at him sharply. "No," she said. "It doesn't." She walked to the window and looked out at the light tower. "It held," she observed. Adrian followed her gaze. The beam remained steady, even in daylight. "It will need maintenance every week in winter," Elena said. "Snow load can shift alignment." "I'll check it," Adrian replied. Elena studied him for a long moment. "You didn't plan to stay," she said. It wasn't accusation. It was fact. Adrian's jaw flexed once. "I didn't plan much." Elena nodded slowly. Sometimes that's how it works, she said. You don't choose a role. You grow into it because no one else is standing there. As Elena spoke, Ranger suddenly stiffened. Not toward the east. Toward Adrian. The dog stepped directly in front of him, blocking his path to the door, eyes fixed upward with an intensity that startled even Elena. Adrian froze. Ranger's gaze was not warning. It was searching. For a split second, Adrian saw something he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge, the reflection of himself in the dog's eyes. Not as a soldier, not as a man who had left something behind, but as someone who had just been looked for. The weight of that recognition landed harder than the storm had. Elena watched the exchange quietly. He knows, she said. Adrian didn't ask what. What the weeks that followed did not bring dramatic events. They brought consistency. A trucker misjudged a logging road and arrived on foot one evening, cheeks cracked by cold and hands trembling. Adrian offered soup, spare gloves, directions at dawn. 2 college hikers appeared one morning, underprepared and embarrassed. He marked their map with careful strokes and explained how the eastern ridge distorted sound. Ranger greeted each arrival the same way, calm, grounded, steady. People began to speak of the island differently, not as Margaret's place, as the light. Mercer returned with 2 handheld radios and a spare battery pack. Off the books, he said, placing them on the table. But useful. Elena brought medical supplies and a weather gauge she mounted near the porch. None of them made speeches about it. They simply acted. Adrian found himself establishing quiet routines. Check generator, clear snow from markers. Test radio at noon. Inspect the tower alignment at dusk. He never called it a mission. He called it habit. One evening, as the sky deepened to cobalt and the light tower glowed against it, Adrian stood on the porch with Ranger beside him. The lake was frozen solid now, a vast white sheet under the early stars. From a distance, a lone figure crossed the ice toward shore, too far to need help, but close enough to see the light. The man paused briefly and lifted a hand in acknowledgement before continuing. Adrian felt something settle inside his chest. Not pride, not redemption, alignment. Ranger leaned into his leg once more. Adrian rested his hand on the dog's head, fingers pressing into thick winter fur. I didn't ask for this, he said quietly. Ranger's tail thumped once against the porch boards. Adrian watched the beam of light cut across ice and snow. He understood now that inheritance was not about property. It was about position. What Margaret had stood here for 30 winters. He was standing here now. Not because he had been ordered, not because he had to prove anything, but because someone might need a point to aim for when everything else disappeared. The wind moved gently from the east, no longer a threat, simply part of the pattern. Inside the cabin, warmth held steady. Outside, the light remained unwavering. Adrian did not announce a decision. He didn't need to. He checked the radios, restocked the woodpile, and adjusted the markers along the ice. The island did not demand gratitude. It demanded presence, and he gave it. Winter did not end with a single warm day. It loosened its grip gradually. The wind softened first, then the sun lingered longer at the edge of the horizon, pressing gold into the frozen lake until faint fractures began to appear along its surface. The ice did not shatter dramatically. It sighed and separated in long, patient seams. Adrian stood on the porch one early morning and watched the first visible line of melt trace across the white expanse. The air no longer bit as sharply in his lungs. It carried the scent of wet stone and thawing pine instead of pure cold. Behind him, the cabin felt different, not quieter, settled. Ranger stood beside him, thicker winter coat now shedding in small tufts along his flanks. The German shepherd's muscles rolled beneath sable fur as he stretched, front paws extended, a back arching slightly before he shook once, scattering frost from his ruff. His amber eyes remained sharp. They always would. But the tension that had defined the deepest winter weeks had eased. Adrian exhaled slowly. He had measured winter in routine's fuel checks, snow clearing, radio tests, tower inspections. Now the rhythm shifted without asking his permission. The radio crackled mid-morning. Cole Mercer's voice came through steady, calmer than during the storms. "Lake's breaking up fast," Mercer reported. "Couple of late-season ice fishermen still out there. We're calling them in." "Copy," Adrian replied. He set the handset down and glanced at Ranger. The dog's ears flicked at the faint static, then returned to their neutral watch. Adrian moved instinctively to the eastern side of the island and scanned the thinning ice. He could see open patches, now dark water, re-emerging in irregular shapes, deceptively beautiful against white. Spring made the lake more dangerous before it made it gentle. He did not need Margaret's notebook to tell him that. By afternoon, a small aluminum boat approached from shore instead of a snowmobile. A man stood at the bow, tall, lean, and younger than Mercer by a few years. His dark hair was pulled back loosely, windblown rather than styled. His face carried the sharpness of someone who had grown up around lakes and weather rather than city grids. He tied off without ceremony. "Name's Caleb Ward," he said once his boots hit the dock. His voice held a quiet steadiness that mirrored Elena's. "Elena's brother." Adrian nodded. Caleb's eyes traveled the light tower first, then the reflective stakes along the shoreline. "You kept it aligned through the storms," Caleb observed. Adrian shrugged. "It mattered." Caleb studied him with curiosity rather than challenge. He had Elena's calm, but his features were rougher slight scar at his brow, on a jaw that carried faint stubble from days spent outdoors. His posture suggested someone comfortable with both solitude and responsibility. "She said you wouldn't brag about it," Caleb added. Adrian gave a faint huff that might have been a laugh. Caleb stepped inside briefly, warming his hands near the stove. "Town's talking," he said. "Not in a spectacle way, just differently." Adrian leaned against the counter, arms folded. "I didn't build this," he replied. "No," Caleb said, "but you didn't walk away from it either." The statement hung in the air. Ranger approached Caleb slowly, sniffed once at his coat lake water, pine sap, machine oil, and then accepted him. Caleb crouched to scratch behind Ranger's ear. "He's the real watchman, isn't he?" he murmured. Adrian didn't correct him. Later that evening, as thaw water dripped steadily from the cabin roof, Ranger did something subtle but profound. He left his usual post near the eastern wall. Instead, he walked to the center of the room and lay down directly beneath the light that hung over the table. Not facing the door, not facing the ridge, facing Adrian. His amber eyes held not vigilance, but peace. Adrian paused mid-step. For months, Ranger had guarded the perimeter. Now he guarded him. The shift was small, but it felt final. The days that followed carried a different kind of work. Adrian removed the reflective stakes one by one as the ice retreated. He inspected the tower's wiring after heavy melt, tightening connections, cleaning away debris that winter had forced into small crevices. Mercer visited less frequently now, emergencies decreasing with the thaw, but each visit held a familiarity that hadn't existed before. One afternoon, as sunlight reflected sharply off broken ice, Mercer stepped onto the porch without removing his gloves. "Council's talking about formalizing the island as an emergency reference point," he said. Adrian stiffened slightly. "That's not why I'm here," he replied. Mercer leaned against the railing. "Relax," he said. "No paperwork yet. Just recognition." Adrian stared out at the lake. Recognition had never been what he'd sought. In fact, he had spent years stepping away from it. He remembered Sarah then. Not vividly, memory had softened her edges, but clearly enough. She had been tall and slender, with light brown hair that slipped loose from whatever knot she'd tied it into by the end of each day. Her skin had burned easily in summer, and she carried quiet patience in the lines around her eyes. She had loved steadily. He had retreated steadily. The night she left, she had not shouted. She had simply grown tired of waiting for him to return from places he refused to describe. Adrian had believed distance protected others from the parts of him that felt fractured. Standing on the porch now, watching the lake reclaim itself, he understood something he hadn't before. Distance also denied them light. Mercer followed his gaze. "You planning to keep it running through summer?" he asked. Adrian looked at the tower. The beam was no longer cutting through snow, but it still shone steady at dusk, a habit now rather than an emergency measure. "Yes," Adrian said finally. Mercer nodded once. "Good." He left without further comment. Spring advanced. The first canoe of the season slid across open water one bright morning. A young couple paddled cautiously, glancing toward the island as if verifying something sacred. Adrian raised a hand in acknowledgement. They waved back. Ranger watched them without tension. Later that week, a middle-aged woman arrived alone in a small rowboat. She introduced herself as June Hollis. She was tall, lean, with dark blonde hair threaded with early gray, braided low against her collar. Her eyes held a depth that came from endurance rather than age. "I worked search and rescue here years ago," she said quietly. "I heard the light was back." Adrian gestured toward the porch. "It never left," he replied. June studied him carefully. "You stayed," she said. Not as praise, but as confirmation. Adrian nodded. She did not ask why. She did not need to. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes, watching the lake break itself open fully under sun. Ranger lay between them, content. When June departed, she left behind a small weather station sensor and a note with her radio frequency. "Not official," she said. "Just connected." The island felt less isolated with each passing week. Not crowded. Connected. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the water in long streaks of copper and rose, Adrian stood once more at the edge of the dock. The lake was alive again, boats gliding, birds returning, wind moving gently from the west now instead of the east. Ranger stood beside him, shedding winter's last remnants in small, drifting strands of fur. Once Adrian felt no urge to leave. He did not scan the horizon for exits. He did not imagine himself elsewhere. The light tower hummed softly behind him. He had once believed that staying required a justification. Now he understood it required presence. The island did not demand heroics. It demanded consistency. As twilight deepened, Adrian walked back to the breaker panel. He rested his hand on the switch briefly, not in doubt, but in acknowledgement. Then he left it on. Outside, the beam extended across open water, no longer fighting storm or snow, simply existing. Ranger moved to his side and leaned gently into him. Adrian rested his hand on the dog's head, fingers threading through thick fur that had guided him more than once. "Good job," he murmured, not sure whether he meant the dog, himself, or the island. The wind carried the scent of thawed earth and distant pine. Somewhere across the lake, someone would glance up tonight and see that steady line of light. They might never know the name of the man who kept it. They would not need to. The island held. The light stayed. And Adrian no longer felt like a man who had escaped his life. He felt like someone who had finally chosen where to stand. Sometimes miracles do not arrive as thunder or sudden rescue. They arrive as a light that stays on when the storm refuses to leave. In this story, the lake did not become calm because someone prayed for easier weather. The wind still turned east. The ice still broke. The danger was real. What changed was this. Someone chose to stand where others might look when they were lost. That is often how God moves in our lives. Not always through dramatic signs, but through quiet conviction, through a steady hand on a switch, through a loyal companion who senses what we cannot, through the courage to remain present when walking away would feel safer. In our daily lives, we face storms that do not look like snow or ice. They look like doubt, like grief, like silence, like responsibilities we never asked for. What we wait for the fear to disappear before we act. But sometimes faith is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to keep the light on anyway. Maybe you are in a season where the wind feels like it is coming from the wrong direction. Maybe you are waiting for clarity before you step forward. This story is a reminder that purpose is often found not in escape, but in presence. Not in perfection, but in consistency. Not in applause, but in obedience to the quiet calling placed in your heart. If this story spoke to you, share it with someone who might need a light right now. Leave a comment and tell us what has helped you stay steady during your hardest season. And if you believe that stories like this matter, consider subscribing to the channel so we can continue keeping the light on together. May God guide your steps when the path disappears. May He strengthen your heart when the wind turns against you. And may you always find or become the light someone else is praying for.